Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our sake marketing seminar. My name is Sara Guterbock. I'm the National Sales Manager for the East Coast with New York Mutual Trading Company. I've been in the industry for many, many years and seen many different trends changing the way that we look at sake around the country. And I was able to work with James Mark, my colleague here in New York, to put together this incredible panel of specialists who are all uniquely promoting sake in their own ways at their own establishments here at some of the most important destinations for food and sake in the Manhattan and Brooklyn area. So really happy to have you guys. I'm going to ask you all to just kind of go down the line and introduce yourselves, let everybody know who you are, where you work, what you do, and maybe a little bit about how you got into the industry. Please.
Sure. So my name's James Mark. I've been working in sake for 8 to 10 years now. I was actually introduced to sake through New York Mutual a very long time ago. Owned my own restaurants where I sold it, and then sold my restaurants last year and joined the company to work for an importer. Right now I work in the city, focusing mostly on on-premise sales, assisting other clients with finding new sake and exploring the New York Mutual portfolio.
Thank you.
My name is Austin Power. Yep. My name is Austin Power. I have a wonderful bar called Accidental Bar on 98 Avenue C between 6th and 7th Street. It's in Alphabet City, which is also the place that I was first introduced to sake. So it's kind of return home. I've been drinking sake for way too long, but I've been working in it for 16 years and just trying to share a little bit of my joy.
My name is Julia Schwartz. I am a sommelier at Claude, which is a restaurant in the East Village. I was introduced to sake actually when I was living in San Francisco and going to a lot of omakases and coming from like a perspective of wine, which is where I think my comfort zone is, and just sort of branching out.
Julia, can you tell everybody what kind of restaurant Claude is?
French-American cuisine, wine-focused. Some people call us a wine bar.
Plus sake.
My name is Sophia Sioris. I'm the manager of Bin Bin Sake, a sake shop in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. I got into sake through wine, actually. I was working at a restaurant with a big wine program, and then I started serving at Rule of Thirds, a Japanese izakaya-style restaurant in Greenpoint, and just fell in love with the beverage. So.
Hi, loud. My name's George Padilla, and I'm one of the co-founders of Rule of Thirds. It's the restaurant that Sophia was just speaking about, and it's a New York-style izakaya, and in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. It's a very large restaurant. It has about 400-person capacity, which is quite different than the previous restaurant that I worked at, which had 12 seats, and so. My journey into sake really came from working in restaurants and finding sake as a really great medium to make connections with people and work at that intersection of Japanese cuisine, hospitality, and craft altogether.
And George, Bin Bin was kind of your brainchild to begin with, right? To add the sake shop, the bottle shop?
Bin Bin Sake started out as a little side project during the pandemic when restaurants had the opportunity to sell bottles directly to customers to go, and it didn't last forever, and so we wanted to continue this mission of getting sake out to people, and that was when Sophia really helped start up the Bin Bin Sake program through tastings, and while we were waiting around for the retail license to come through, and once we opened our doors, it's been great.
Can either of you explain what Bin Bin means?
So Bin Bin, it means, it's a reference to the two different bottle sizes. Isho Bin is my favorite, the magnum size bottles.
1.8 liter.
Yongo Bin, the 720 ml. It's also
Bottle,
the name of our
mascot. It kind of means bottle, which means you should buy 2 bottles every time you go. So guys, we want this to be an interactive seminar. So please, if anybody has a question at any time, maybe wave at me and let me know. I may ask you to repeat the question so that I can ask the panel. But we have a series of questions that we want these guys to kind of discuss and talk about, maybe to inspire some of you with their unique ways of approaching sake. So for the group as a whole, we are interested a little bit in the type of clientele that you work with. What do you notice right now? How is that clientele changing? I think it's something, at least I noticed, has been evolving for quite some time. And I think that dining as a whole and just drinking as a whole, even if you're drinking at home, has become something that's more experiential for people. They sort of want to show the experience of that drink. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that. We also want to hear a bit about any trends that you're noticing at your establishments. Are people asking for certain things? So maybe we can get started there. And James, with that in mind, how do you approach that when you're working with these clients and others to promote?
Yeah, so first of all, my clients, the people I serve are restaurants and retail shops. So I don't work directly with customers as much anymore, at least compared to when I own my own restaurants. But as far as like what restaurants are buying sake right now, especially from like a Western perspective, our bread and butter are from as far as like Western restaurants are concerned are certainly still Asian fusion kind of places, American Japanese, American Chinese restaurants. But you're seeing it more and more branch out. I have a few Italian restaurants in my clients that are in my pool now that I'm really, really excited about. A few American restaurants that are distinctly not serving Asian food, are not serving Japanese food. And, it's just about expanding and shifting perspective on sake, in my opinion, from being a strictly Japanese beverage that you only drink when you're having Japanese food into restaurants that don't serve strictly Japanese food. It's a world beverage. It's something that you can drink with pizza and hamburgers and French fries as easily as you can drink with sashimi or sushi and everything in between. And that's really why I really wanted the four of these folks to be here today, is because all of them work at different restaurants, different bars, serving different kinds of food that all work in a beautiful way with sake. Austin, can you describe what you guys do for food at Accidental Bar and how that reflects with the sake that you serve?
So when I started Accidental Bar, I really wanted to focus on saying, and I will caveat that I opened during Pride Month and I am a gay, so I had a little leeway with all the PR, but specifically saying I'm a sake bar but not a Japanese restaurant. Because so many people introduce themselves to me saying, like, I only have sake with sushi, and that's delicious. That's delicious, but it's a very specific experience. There are so many different expressions, and there are so many parallels through food globally that I focus on things that maybe have a little bit more of a southern bent. I'm from South Carolina. And there are a lot of similarities to Japanese cuisine classically because South Carolina is famous for rice trade. They are great for seafood. Their predominant meat product is pork. And they also didn't have a lot of spice trade, so the food is very ingredient focused. And all of that comes through in the cuisine, but you wouldn't normally make that parallel if you weren't just a country bumpkin who also loves sake. So.
Wonderful.
So I think just coming from a perspective of wine, I deal with like misconceptions about what one should drink with what you're eating all the time. Like there's countless times a night where someone is like, well, we ordered mostly seafood, so we can't drink red, right? So there's just all these sorts of rules that people have developed that I think in a multitudes of ways I'm always trying to dismember in a way, because that's definitely not true, and you should definitely drink what you want to drink primarily all the time. But also red wine can be great with seafood, and sake can be great with things that are not seafood. So at Claude, no one's going to mistake us for an Asian cuisine restaurant, I don't think. So in a way, simply providing sake by the glass as an option has done a lot to, I think, frame how people understand sake to go with food. So we're already telling them sake goes with our food. So it's creating this like baseline curiosity, which has been really fun to work with.
And so one of the things I had the opportunity to eat at Claude just this week, and it was incredible. And they have this amazing wifi, this with cheese and tomato, like it's very high umami ingredients, and the package is distinctly like French, right? This beautiful summer dish, and like that and sake just sung together. And you, Austin, have a grilled cheese sandwich too, right? That you guys do. Any more?
We do a wheat lacoche quesadilla.
That's it, the quesadilla. Yeah, so that like matching sort of umami with sake to me is something that helps break through the mold, as you're saying, with outside of just because we often, I think, make the mistake of thinking only Japanese food or Asian foods have this umami, when really many more ingredients display that characteristic. Correct?
We actually have a BYOB pizza place around the corner from the shop, and I've noticed a lot more people thinking of us as their beverage of choice for the evening, which is exciting. But another thought I had as you were all speaking is that a lot of people come to the shop looking for guidance, and one of the easiest ways to recommend sake is based off of what they're eating for dinner, and they're going to be taking it home and they're going to be keeping it in their fridge for an elongated period of time, so they get the opportunity to try it with like a myriad of foods. And if you can just point them in the direction of something that like might be unexpected, I think you've like got someone to enjoy sake at home.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm stuck working in a Japanese restaurant, and so I'm glad these folks are doing the good work here. But yeah, I think I am really excited to see Bin offering this opportunity for people to like really bring sake into their lifestyle, even if it's just like a gateway bottle of yuzu sake. You know, I think we've all probably experienced like there are some sakes that people just beeline straight for, and while you know I might in turn in that, under my breath think like there's so much more to sake than just yuzu sake. I think it's really important to appreciate that there's a lot of different entry points for people, and it's not that there's a linear path for learning about sake or getting into sake. And I think what we've done at Bin and at Rule of Thirds is try to offer as many different entry points into the world of sake as possible.
So that brings us to a really good question, which is how do you sell sake? How do you get people on the hook? And I think it's interesting because all of you have something different that you're doing. And maybe starting at this end with you guys, because you're working, you know, essentially two different concepts within one another with a completely opposite experience, right? So, George, you have the opportunity to walk up to the table, see what people are eating, and be like, hey, you should try this. This is awesome, right? And then, Sophia, you know, you're sort of having this other opposite conversation. What are you planning? What do you like? What can I make a recommendation of? You know, here again, we have this like experience with cocktails. You have an experience with like, you know, very different types of food. You know, Austin has this captive audience where you were mentioning recently that you're noticing a lot of people are still coming in very new to sake. And of course, you know, with James, you're going and speaking to all these different restaurants and sommeliers. So I just love to kind of go down the line and ask you about your philosophies. How are you talking about sake? How are you getting people, not just, because sometimes people are like, nah, maybe not. And it's like, how do you get them over that hump? Where is that entry point? How do you start the dialogue? How do you seal the deal?
I think for me, the most important thing is just personally being excited about the product. And I think that's how I found my way into this whole industry in the first place, was just finding food that I was a huge fan of and wanted to share with other people and help get the word out, because I cared about supporting the producers and the people behind it. And I think that's an important starting point. And if you have that as your kind of fuel and motivation, I think you'll find the ways to connect with people. And in the restaurant itself, it is a Japanese restaurant, not a traditional Japanese restaurant, but based on foundations of Japanese cuisine. And
can I pause you there? Because I want to emphasize something that you said to our audience. So you're talking about selling from a passion point, you know, your excitement. And I think for our clients here who maybe run a restaurant or a bar, and you know you're doing staff training, you're working with people, the more that you can get your staff excited, the more the people who are working there walk up to the table super stoked to talk about sake. this is what gets people really excited to even just stay in a conversation with you. And we also know, like, just through successful sales techniques, that conversation that you have with that customer, even if they still say no thank you at that moment, it goes into their file of information. And the next time they're more likely to take advantage of your recommendation just because you've taken the time to talk about it. So this kind of enthusiasm builds for every single experience. And I think that's a really important point that you just made.
Yeah, and I think it's those moments when you find that connection to sake, it can come from so many different places. I mean, for me, it was really a light bulb aha moment when I had a chance to meet two tojis that were visiting from Japan for the first time. And I'd already been kind of working with sake for a year or two, but really making that personal connection and hearing the personal stories from the tojis, that totally changed my perspective and my approach to how I talked about sake and how I sold sake. But it doesn't have to be that kind of encounter. You don't have to go to Japan to have these kind of like really deep, impactful moments. It could just be having a really great night with friends and like remembering that bottle or remembering what you ate with it. And so I think if for anybody who's really wanting to learn more about sake or feel like could be a little bit more effective in your work with sake, you have to just find those opportunities, and it doesn't necessarily have to be go find a toji and meet them, go to Japan, just like spend some time in the room next door and support your local sake shop and go drink sake at Claude and Accidental Bar. I think it does take some homework of just getting out there and being open to those experiences.
I did. I just wanted to say really quickly that I think there are two major things customers say that get really intimidating for servers. And one is, I don't really like sake, which is always very funny to me because I've always worked in very sake-forward places. So I'm like, so you don't like sake, but you came to a sake bar. You just told on yourself. Like, you want to like sake, you had a bad one once. That's okay. It's an opportunity. Or they'll say, I don't really know that much about sake, which usually means I'm on a date and I really want it to go well. Can you help me not look stupid? And so every time a guest is telling you something from a place of uncertainty, they're just asking you to help them because they don't have the vocabulary. And I think sometimes education can be intimidation. And that is our job, is to just make it simple and to point to you and saying, like, having a joyful experience, I think, is the core of enjoying any type of beverage and alcohol, especially fundamentally in the United States where we don't learn anything at a base level about drinking. We just develop our palates based on having a good time with friends, and everything else is exploration outside of that. So help people have a joyful moment and then educate after you know what they like.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting about doing sake sales, and something I really harp on with when I do staff trainings, is that sake versus wine versus beer, and what you're speaking on, where the vernacular of sake often gets lost on everyone, and it's because like even if like you don't have a deep knowledge of wine, you don't have a deep knowledge of beer, like here in the West, like that culture surrounds you to a certain degree. And so I can like pull a random person, maybe not at the show here, but I can pull a random person off the street and ask them what's a Merlot. They might not know what it is exactly, but they know, oh, it's a kind of wine. I can pull that same person, ask them what is a Junmai, and they probably don't know what it is. And that's just like a lack of vernacular and education around that. And so it's like it's not important necessarily to concentrate on that aspect of things, especially in your first steps, and just like provide a really beautiful experience and understand that people are coming from they're coming not from the same place that they are with other beverages. And so it's like just making that first impression. The thing that's a real opportunity with sake, I mean that's clearly a challenge. One of the opportunities with sake is because it exists in the space that people have such a low knowledge base of. In New York City, there's great wine in so many different venues, like really beautiful wine, so many great importers. And there's a lot of great sake importers, but nowhere near what is being imported for wine. And so, the average consumer has a higher knowledge level of wine. And so, like, they could walk into your restaurant and get a great glass of wine, and you just took them from, let's say, 50, because that's like they know what good wine tastes like. You took them to 100, and that's awesome. They leave, they're happy, everybody wins. You can do the same thing with beer. But with sake, you're not taking them from 50. Their starting point is 25. Their starting point is 0. Their starting point is -20, because they think that they don't like sake. And then you show them a great glass or a great bottle. And you took them, maybe you didn't take them, maybe it's not their favorite beverage in the world, but you took them to 80. You didn't go from 50 to 100. You went from -20 to 80. And that's such a bigger gap that you just bridged. And not only did you just make this larger impression on them, and this is what I really hammer with when I do staff trainings, is you've changed your life in a very small way, about a very, like, not significant, but still changed your life in a way about a beverage. They walked into your establishment thinking that they were either neutral or didn't like a product. And they walked out thinking, oh, actually I like sake. And that's cool. And that's the kind of thing that, like, from a business owner perspective and a server perspective, leads to one, bigger tips, more remembrance, more return guests. Because now you didn't just get a great meal at this restaurant. You didn't just get a great glass of wine and wonderful service. Like, oh, this is the restaurant I had that great glass of sake at. This is that great restaurant that, like, I had that great bottle at. That, like, oh, I didn't think I liked sake before I went to this place, but now I really love sake. Or I had that great bottle there. And so it's like an amazing opportunity to make a massive impression on a guest that you don't get as much with wine, that you don't get as much with beer.
I think as things become more, as we said, experiential and dining trends, that's also something really important for getting people to come back in the door. And I think that's another thing where outside of Asian restaurants, or even, as much as, Rule of Thirds is Japanese, there's so many things that you guys are doing that have their own twist on it that I think are very different. And so that idea of having people come in and have that experience and say, wow, I really want to come back because this thing just happened to me, or I just tasted this thing I never had before. One question I have for the group, though, coming back to language, if you were to take out these ideas of expecting somebody understands what Junmai Daiginjo means or Tokubetsu Honjozo, how are you describing sake to your guests and introducing them? I'd really love to hear from everyone. And I also want to ask Austin to maybe recite from memory a couple of your tasting notes for the group. But we can start anywhere.
Well, like, similar to what James was just talking about, I think there's an interesting nuance to the difference between a guest's curiosity about sake than about wine. I think there are high standards for wine in New York City culture, and people are more comfortable admitting they don't know about sake than admitting they don't know about wine. So I find the initiation on the guest's end to be really exciting. People ask a lot about it. They're not afraid to admit they have no idea what any of the words mean. As far as how we bridge connections, it happens in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's not very different than wine. I think a lot of what we do at Claude is about producer perspective. So sometimes just stripping away the jargon and just talking about production point of view and the hands behind it, and like sake
it's
breweries,
like the story.
Yeah, the sake breweries always have such passion and real people doing real work for generations, and we talk about that with benchmark winemakers all the time. There's no reason why we shouldn't make sake about that as well. And then using sake in things like a cocktail, I think, also creates a different entry point where people are less intimidated by it because it's built like a drink and with flavors that sound familiar. And they also just happen to be enjoying sake, so it's like taking whatever box they're in and turning it on its head a little.
I agree. I feel like when I was working in the restaurant as a server, people were way more willing to try anything that I was excited about because they could just kind of commit to one cup of sake. But now, in a retail perspective, maybe they're going into the experience spending a little bit more on a bottle than they would on their bottle of wine. And I think leaning on producers' stories, food pairings, but also just letting the customer know that just because they had one sake that they didn't like, there's a whole wide range of sakes, and that always, it surprises me how much it surprises other people that there's a style out there for them that they could really enjoy if you just take the time with them to, like, jargonless and all, just be like, this one tastes umami, earthy, this one might be fruity, zesty. Like, people need to know that there are a lot more options than just the one they had that time.
I think you make a really good point about the price point as well. I think a lot of people, so for a long time in the USA, our sake trends were very often led by inexpensive domestically made sake. So there were a lot of people, I think, who had the impression that sake was just hot and went down like gasoline, and you were supposed to scream, sake bomb or something when you did it. And of course, that's completely changed now. And I find that a lot of consumers are shocked that ounce per ounce, most sake, high quality sake, costs far more than the average bottle of wine that people are going to buy for even for a buy the glass program or something to take home. So what is something you might tell somebody about that expensive bottle that might help convince them to buy it?
I'm not sure if this is the correct approach, but letting people know that they can drink their sake over like a longer period of time than their bottle of wine has always helped. Like, I get a lot of aha moments being like, oh great, like I don't have to finish it tonight. So that really helps. It is a little bit higher in alcohol usually, so it kind of helps them understand that they're getting, more alcohol from their bottle. And then, those are the two main things. But I also think, like, this is coming from Japan. It's not coming from California necessarily. So we can all understand why it's going to be more expensive in that regard.
Well, one of the things I find people ask me, and they're like, is this good quality? And I'm like, yeah, it's really good quality. And, we have these, ways of designating quality in Japan. We have this Tokuteme Shoshu, specially designated sake. In Japan, they have a lot of normal sake that people drink that's not classified. But about 98% of what comes to the United States is that high-grade sake. So just generally speaking, even what we think might be more average is going to be very good quality sake, and they can drink it. And then, James, you were going to talk about that too, I think, about from the restaurant advantage. Again, the fact that the bottles can be kept open for a longer period of time, and the idea of doing a buy the glass program.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent of buy the glass programs. I think that for on-prem, I love cup sake, but cup sake, frankly, only really makes sense in retail perspectives from a price perspective. You can do it if you're willing to run some lower margins, but if you have the ability to run a buy the glass program, I think a buy the glass program is a really incredible opportunity. For a couple different reasons. The biggest is that because there's a little lack of standardization, you are given a lot of flexibility to make money in different ways. So what I mean by that is twofold. It's two axes, really. The first is your portion size. In New York City, the standard pour for sake is anywhere between 2.5 to 5 ounces, depending on where you go. Like a 3-ounce pour is what I generally recommend to people, 3 to 3.5. But there's places where, like, I know that some people say they do 4-ounce pours and they do 5-ounce pours.
And if you're a friend.
Yeah. And so, but what I mean by that is, like, 3 ounces in a wine glass can look like a lot of sake. And no one's going to think that you're being cheap with it. And on the same token, the markups, depending on what your restaurant is and what you're trying to achieve with that restaurant, you can run a 3 times markup by the glass, you can run a 5 times markup by the glass, you could run a 5 times markup by the bottle. I know restaurants that do that as well. And so, there's a lot of flexibility in your pricing that I'm not here to. I don't judge restaurants for how they choose to do that because ultimately, like, I don't know what your costs are, but it's an opportunity for you to make additional profit depending on what your needs are, or get more sake and move more sake out there and move more volume if that's what more of your goal is. I think that's a really cool part about sake. With wine, like, I feel like it's a little bit more standardized, or there's certain expectations. I don't sell wine though, so I'm kind of talking out the side of my neck with that one. I don't know, Julie. How do you guys handle pricing? And
We don't price much differently than we price wine. The benefits are different, of course. For by the glass, we don't have to, like a bottle of sparkling wine, once that we serve by the glass, there's a lot of waste associated with that because it doesn't, after 24 hours, the bubbles aren't there. We are dumping, you just end up having to put some stuff down the drain. We're never in that position with sake because of its shelf life. We do pour different ounces, so it's 3 ounces for sake and 5 ounces for wine.
3 ounces, by the way, is the standard serving in Japan.
Yeah.
So a 3-ounce pour is a standard serving in Japan, and so that's great.
I think a lot of people, I was prepared for questions from guests about that because there are a lot of environments where you get a carafe of sake with a cup, and that's like something someone might be more familiar with. If you are pouring for 4 people and everyone's doing a different glass of something and 3 of them are doing wine and 1 of them is doing sake and they're all in the same glass, there's the visual aspect that I am always a little bit conscious of and sort of prepared to answer questions about. But people don't ask. People, like, I think, again, it's maybe like being more comfortable not knowing about it and just rolling with it.
But if you think about it, people don't necessarily question you like, why is my shot of whiskey only this big and my glass of beer only this big, right? So I think because sake is its own category, people are kind of accepting it in its own place,
yeah.
Right?
I think that's exactly what we see, and I think they're just mostly just excited to try it. We treat it like, in a lot of ways, we just treat it like wine.
So I want to come back to the marketing aspects, and I do really want to get Austin to share a little bit. So I've had really wonderful experiences at all of your establishments. I've been at the table and had George come by and be like, just popping Isho bean on the table and be like, you're going to try this, and you're going to try this. I've had similar stuff here. I just would love to talk a little bit about that approach and, sort of the experience that adds. So with your list, Austin, can you talk about how you write your tasting notes and sort of the feeling that you want to evoke for people?
So Accidental Bar is literally my delusion come to reality. My restaurant opened right after the pandemic, and there's no good reason why I own it. It just, I said a thing and it happened. I don't know. So
It happened by accident?
It happened by accident, truly. And so I try to take that opportunity to really be a very polite bully and force people into having as best an experience they can with sake to what I'm allowed. So we really focus on products that aren't highly represented in the marketplace in New York, so that you're tasting something maybe outside of your regular rotation. I think glassware is very important. I think that a lot of people see ochoko and they think that, sake is shots because it's a small format, and we don't necessarily do a lot of education around sake glassware and why the format is, why the material is, how that informs your drinking experience, how it conducts heat. So I chose a glassware that looks like a very tiny solo cup, but it's also a very, very thin glass. It's got a tiny bowl. It's like a wine glass, but it isn't. And just because the glass shape is different, the experience is unique.
It's almost like an Italian bistro wine glass, but extremely thin, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Very that. And so it's like, if the sake isn't the temperature that you need it to be right now, you can hold your hand on it for 1 minute and you can change it a couple of degrees. We do say it's 4 ounces. We serve 4.5 to 5 ounces. But part of the reason for that is because, like, taking a sip of something and loving it is also like your first kiss. And then a lot of times you're bored. by the end of the glass. And so I really want people to sit with something, experience the temperature change, enjoy it over the meal, and see how that shifts. So it's a very serious sake menu with very silly people. And so with that said, like, our menu is arranged going north to south, east to west through Japan. We have a map that's in the menu so that you can follow along by prefecture. I spell everything out on the top level for all of the bottles because I want people to be able to find them if they need to research. And then my descriptions are so stupid.
Well, so this is what I really wanted to touch on because it evokes a feeling, right? So I don't know if you have any memorized, but can you share some of your descriptions?
Yeah, so one of the bottles, which it's been in New York forever, but it's the Kurosawa Nagori. It is so affordable. It's really delicious. One of my former chefs works for Food and Wine and wrote an article about it in their summer issue last year. And the description is cantaloupe and karaoke.
Cantaloupe and karaoke.
Cantaloupe and karaoke. That's it. It's so beautiful. A really gorgeous sake, Kazunomori, which tastes super like peaty and earthy and strange. That was like drinking gin with a swamp witch. And mostly what I'm looking for out of the menu descriptions is to just get someone to ask a follow-up question or to commit based on an energy. Because returning to, we don't know where everyone's palate is at. If you can just hit one core moment, you can get around the rest. And then to piggyback on by the glass pours, I opened Accidental as a purely by the glass sake bar because I wanted people to have the opportunity to change their mind. Like, you don't have to overcommit. And I think in terms of bottle sales, like with beverage, there is such an intimidation factor where, like, with food, you'll order something just to try it. Maybe you don't like it. And I'm like, but people are so scared to waste their money on alcohol. And I'm like, oh, babe, but if you didn't like it, you learned something and you're still drunk.
One of my favorite quotes from Marguerite Mondavi was, the only thing you have to lose by opening a bottle is boredom.
Yeah.
George, how about you? Would you talk a little bit about how you approach the dialogue? And
So at Rule of Thirds, our menu is 2 pages of sake, and it's about maybe 25 or so SKUs printed. I wish I could fit more, but that's all that fits. And of those, there's maybe only 3 or 4 at a time that are bottle only. Everything is offered by the glass and carafe or bottle. And in some cases, I stock both formats of Isho bin and Yongo bin for a sake. So Isho bin for the glass and carafe pours, which really helps with costing, and then the Yongo bin to help with that bottle sale for the table. And actually, based on the way that I price the sakes, it's about a 5x markup or 25% cost for the single pours, and for the carafe as well, and then bottles a little bit of a deal relatively to the pours.
So people are encouraged to like buy a larger format, right? Eventually, like start by the glass and then maybe get a larger format. Or
my ideal experience for them would be to get try a different sake every round, and I want them to explore the menu a lot. And but I think it seems like the typical diner's tendency, or like their comfort zone, is to kind of pick a bottle and just like be comfortable with that for the duration of their meal, which it's similar to the experience that they're used to with wine. So there's a lot of choose your own adventure opportunity at Rule of Thirds, and certainly our servers are really great at guiding people through that process. But in terms of how we market it, I mean, Sophia can speak to this, but I'm terrible at organizing lists of these sakes, and I just kind of have one big section that just says sake for natural wine lovers. And it's not that these are funky sakes necessarily, or that they're all wild yeasted or organic rice, but it's just a little bit of a tagline that from the very beginning, year before I opened Rule of Thirds, and thinking about how to get people to enjoy sake, how to get people curious and just started to explore sake. And at that time, me personally kind of going through this really exciting period of learning about and discovering and really diving into natural wine after spending so many years really like immersed in the sake industry, I thought to just ride the coattails of the natural wine movement and just slap it on the menu, which it does provide a conversation starter. And there's a lot of different ways that we can build bridges between folks that are interested and have a little bit more familiarity with natural wine and sake. And one of the most simple ways is just to explain the term junmai and how junmai is just literally 4 simple ingredients. And, you know, if just at that very basic fundamental level, you know what's in your glass, that's something that can be relatable to a wine drinker.
I've noticed for a lot of natural wine lovers too, just the fact that it's illegal to add sulfites to sake is another thing. They're like, oh, okay. Like they feel like, oh, now I can pass through that door safely and trust. You know, and how many of them are already naturally vegan? They don't have to worry about, you know, those additives. I think that's amazing.
That's a good point. There's no sulfites in sake, so you never get a hangover.
That's right. So we only have a few minutes left. I want to make sure we have a chance for some questions from anybody in the audience. But I also, before we do transition, most of you have some incredible cocktail things you're doing with sake. I think there's sake and beer. There's an incredible like sake sour at Claude that I really wanted to hear about, and of course your program as well. So maybe you can start us off.
So Claude has a beer and wine license. We don't have liquor, which I don't think is like a problem for us, but it does create an interesting constraint for how you make the most out of our program. Sake has all sorts of textures and body weights, so I do think it's an underrated cocktail ingredient. I think it provides great freshness, flavor, and without liquor, the challenge of any cocktail is a lot of the times it's power and weight. So we kind of thought this would be a fun thing to experiment with. One of my coworkers has like a great mind for this stuff, and so she kind of saw a New York sour variation using the whiskey barrel-aged sake, yuzu sake. We add more citrus, we add some honey, we add citric acid, and then there's a red wine float. It's incredibly drinkable. I think it feels adventurous, but also very comfortable when you're drinking it, which is kind of the magic, I think that combination is like key that unlocks a lot of doors in like a hospitality environment, which is like help people feel like they're trying something new, but also make them feel comfortable. It's just been, it's wildly popular, so it's clearly working.
It's delicious. The one thing that I noticed about it was with that Cab Franc float is how you really can taste that it's actually Cab Franc on the top.
Yeah.
The float is so magically done by increasing the density of the base of the cocktail.
Yeah.
And then each component, although it works together as a whole, it still stands alone. You know, you can notice the yuzu character, you notice that hint from the whiskey barrel. And I think that's something that's really, really hard to achieve because sake can be so subtle that it can become kind of a muddle if it's not handled properly. So if you guys haven't, anybody gets to go to Claude and try that cocktail. It's outstanding. Mm-hmm. What about you guys? You guys are doing a lot of shochu on your cocktail program. Are you doing anything with sake as an ingredient?
There are some cocktails, like a variation of our highball, that's the El Kimono, that's one of the most popular cocktails. It does use some sparkling sake. There have been, that's the most prominent example on the menu right now. Brian Evans, our partner and director of bars for my partner's hospitality group, he's a huge proponent of shochu and cocktails, and it's been really amazing to see that as a gateway and introduction to shochu in the cocktail world. And for me, I've always kind of come from maybe a more traditional sake background where I'm like, why would you want to mix sake with anything else? It's like, it's all about, the craft of that beverage. But actually, through this experience of working with Brian and just really appreciating the craft of bartending, I have definitely come around and I'm excited to see cocktails with sake incorporated in a tasteful way, and I think it can be done beautifully.
It's a really interesting evolution. Thank you.
Probably also good to add that when you're opening a business right now, getting a liquor license is increasingly difficult, and like sake categorically is a huge asset when your program is limited in that way, like general.
And also, shochu 24% and under is now available for beer and wine licenses, which is very exciting.
Austin, do you want to talk about the beer drink that you do really quick?
Yes. So, well, I do one basic person cocktail all of the time for friends who are scared to try sake for the first round. And that's a little different style. So typically I do 2 ounces of a shochu, 1 ounce of a complimentary sake, and then 1 ounce of some kind of juice or barley tea, depending on the season, just to make it really delightful and palatable. And I don't think that's a super typical combination, but sake and shochu together, they lengthen each other and smooth out the corners, and it's a really beautiful combination. So just putting it out there. But traditionally, I have a drink called the Austin Special, which is really just a fancy sake bomb. And to be very controversial, I love sake bombs. It got me into drinking sake. It was the best thing at my mama's bar. And the reason I work in hospitality is because the bartenders were like, if we get you drunk, you will talk too much and we will make more tips. So they named the Austin Special after me. It's tall sake bomb. Now we make a very elevated version where we're pairing the beer and the cocktail, the sake together. And it also helps me explain the difference between Hanjozo and Junmai style sakes and what the presence of Jozo does in sake. So when you're adding a higher alcohol to a brewed sake beverage, how it changes the complexion. And a lot of people think that when you add brewer's alcohol, it's going to make the sake sharper. It does the exact opposite. It softens the corners, it increases the aroma, and it makes it more delicious. So that's what we do with the beer cocktail. And you don't chug it, you just sip it. It's delicious.
Yeah, 2 things. The first was, something that Julie was saying, how much of an asset sake is, especially in a city like New York, where there's so much great wine, and I really feel like sommeliers in order to separate themselves out, having as many tools in the tool belts is really, really important. And so having sake in the back pocket as an additional tool to use while you're making pairings, while you're recommending something by the glass, really, really helps. And it was really a strong asset. The second thing is I know it. I've made them at Bin Bin, and I know you've made them before. But my favorite sake cocktail is not made with sake, but with double roku and beer. It's 1 part double roku, which we sell by the double roku from Niwa no Gisu, Yamaguchi, Shuzo, and Fukuoka, and then 1 part Orion beer mixed together. Sounds really gross, but it's an incredible
fantastic
cocktail. I love it to death. Some people don't love it, and that's okay, but they're wrong.
So we're just about out of time. I wanted to open up the floor if anybody has any questions for our panel. Anything about marketing sake, writing a menu, inviting people to the table, opening up a dialogue. We're yours. If there are no questions, I want to make sure we thank everybody profusely for your time, your expertise, and especially for being people at the head of this movement. You guys are in really important roles of leadership in this city. I think it's really, really incredible what all of you are doing, and we're so incredibly grateful for the passion with which you welcome people to the table and in the door and out the door with 2 bottles, 2 bins every time. Thank you all so very much for your time. We'll all be available for a little bit. If anybody has a question, if you're shy, please come up and say hi.